Welcome back, everybody, to this series where we're building an end-to-end type-safe application using React, Prisma, and GraphQL. If you weren't around for the previous videos, we have successfully set up our front-end application, which is using React and TypeScript. In the previous video, we set up all of the little pieces that we need to actually build out a GraphQL API. And then in this video, what we're going to focus on is actually using those pieces to build out our GraphQL API. So what that means is we're going to be building our GraphQL schema. We're going to be setting up a couple of queries, and then what we're going to be doing is setting up a couple of tools within our GraphQL API to make sure that everything is nice and type safe. And so by the end of this video, what we should have is a GraphQL API that we can use and query for some data. So let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. So jumping into the code, what I've got here is our index.ts file. If you missed the last video where we set up this entire project, I highly recommend you go back and go through that video first, because this will build off of all of what we did there. But what you're looking at right now is just our index.ts file. It's got a console log in it. That's all it's doing right now because we didn't install any packages. We haven't set up a GraphQL server or anything. That's what we're going to do here. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to pop open a terminal window, and we're going to install a package that allows us to set up a GraphQL server. And to do this, we're going to use GraphQL Yoga. It's a pretty popular package out there that's a GraphQL server. And to use it, we're going to have to install it. So what I'm going to do first is npm install, and then it is GraphQL Yoga, and it's for Node. So that's the package there that we're going to install. And then in order to use this, we're actually going to need to install GraphQL as well, which is the actual language library. So we'll install that, and I'll go ahead and run this. So this is going to install those two packages for us. And once that's installed, we can actually get that up and going. So we'll replace our console log, and we're actually going to import a item from that GraphQL Yoga library that we're going to use to start a server. So I'll do import, and it is create server from, and it's from this GraphQL Yoga node library. And with that, we have the function now to actually instantiate our server, and then we can use that to get a server running. But we are going to need to know what port we're going to run the server on. So let's go ahead and already create a variable for that. I'm just going to call it port. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a process.env.api port. So the reason I'm doing that is because when we go to deploy this application, we're probably going to specify the port that we're actually running this on through the environment. So I'm just going to go ahead and preemptively create this process to grab it from the environment variables. And we'll say that if there is no API port variable in our environment, then we could just use port 4000. So the next piece that we're going to need is we're going to need to actually use the create server function to instantiate our server. So I'll create a new variable called server, and we're going to pass it this create server function right here. And this is going to take in an object, and this object is going to allow us to pass in some options. And the very first option is going to be a port. And for that, we're just going to use the port that we created. And then lastly, we're going to start up our server. So we'll do server.start. And if I remember correctly, this just goes with a then. And then we're going to say, we'll do console log. And just to make it pretty, I'll add a cool little emoji here. Let's do a rocket. There's our rocket there. And we'll say server started on port, and then we'll just put the port there. And so that should be it for that. So if we actually run this right now, we're going to see that our server has started on port 4000. So what we can do now is open up our browser, localhost 4000, GraphQL, and we're going to see that we get this Yoga playground. So this is the GraphQL playground where you can actually view your GraphQL schema, and within here you can run different queries. So for example, I could run this query. Right now we don't have any GraphQL schema defined, so there's actually nothing to query except for this default greetings query that GraphQL Yoga gives you. So that's what this is going to look like. And this view here, this is what we're going to use a lot to test our queries once we've written them. So we will just keep that open for reference. But at this point, we've got a GraphQL server up and running, and we're ready to get going with some of the next pieces. Now, the very next piece that we're going to set up is this library called Pothos. And what Pothos is going to do for us is it's going to give us a way to build out our GraphQL schema. Now, if you are not familiar already, there are two different ways that you could build a GraphQL schema. You could do what's called schema first, where you actually manually write out your schema and then you write your code based off of that schema. Or you could do code first, where you use a library like Pothos that provides a set of functions that help you build up your GraphQL schema within your code itself. And then that actually generates a GraphQL schema for you based off of your code. So we're going to do that. And so very first, we're going to have to install this Pothos library. So we're going to do npm install Pothos core and get that guy installed. And that gives us a object called a builder, which is going to be our schema builder. So we're going to need an instance of that we can reuse throughout different places in our application. So go ahead and in your source directory, create a builder.ts file. And at the very top of this file, you're going to import the schema builder. I could spell this right. And then you're going to export an instance of that. So we're going to do export const builder equals new schema builder. And we'll give it an empty config object for now. So this is going to be our builder. This comes with a bunch of different functions that will help you build up your GraphQL schema, add different types, and add queries and mutations, and different things like that. So that's what we've got there. But before we can actually use this to start building out our GraphQL API, what we're going to need to do is set up a custom scalar type on it. If you are familiar with the GraphQL ecosystem already, you might know that GraphQL comes with a specific set of data types that it will support to expose through a GraphQL API. And if we actually pop open our Prisma schema and look at our user model, we'll see we have a couple different data types here. The name, for example, is a string, which will work perfectly fine in our GraphQL API. GraphQL can expose a string value through its API and return it from the request. But GraphQL does not, however, have a date data type by default, so we're going to have to set that up ourselves so that we could tell GraphQL how it should handle this created at field. So back over here in this builder.ts, this is where we're going to have to set that up. We need to let Pothos know that there's going to be a date type, and Pothos will handle sort of setting up the custom type in the GraphQL schema itself. But to do that, we're going to have to install a package. So I'm going to do npm install GraphQL Scalars. This is a community package maintained by GraphQL users that gives you access to different scalar types and their resolvers. So it lets GraphQL know how to resolve these different pieces of data. So let's import one thing from this called date resolver. And this is the function that will actually resolve a date value for you in your GraphQL schema. And then the next thing we got to do is we have to set up a generic on this instance of the schema builder. And within this is where we're going to define these custom scalars. So we're going to have scalars, and then we're going to do date. And this takes in two different keys. This is going to take in an input, and that'll be date. And then it's going to take in an output, and that'll be date as well. And what these do is it tells Pothos how to use a date value in different areas of your GraphQL schema. So for example, if you're in a GraphQL resolver, it'll need to know in that resolver how to resolve a date value. And we're saying turn it into a date, a JavaScript date. And for the output, that's how it gets exposed through the GraphQL API. So that's what we've got to do there. And then the last piece we need to do to get dates working is actually set it up in our builder. That was just sort of the typing for it. Now we need to actually add the scalar type to our builder. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this scalar type date. We're going to say that we want to resolve this date using a date resolver. And there's more config you could pass it. We're just going to leave that empty for now. So at this point, we now have our builder set up, and it is also set up to handle this date scalar type. So we should be able to handle every data type now that's in our database schema. And the next piece that we're going to need to set up is actually a piece in our schema.prisma. The reason that we're using Pothos and the reason this works so nicely in our application is because it has a cool plugin system, and there's a great plugin written for Prisma specifically. And what this plugin is going to do is it's going to generate some types based off of our Prisma schema that help us ensure that we're building our GraphQL API schema in a way that sort of aligns with our database schema. That way we're not trying to access or expose fields that don't exist in our database. So that's super cool, and we're going to use that for sure in this application. And to use it, we actually need to install the plugin. So we'll do npm install at Pothos, and it is plugin-prisma. So we'll get that guy installed. And with that installed, we can now go into our schema.prisma and head up to where our generators are. This is a new generator that we're going to be adding, and we'll call it Pothos. And what this generator is going to take in is a single key. It's going to take in a provider, and the provider's name is Prisma Pothos types. So now when we regenerate our Prisma client and when we regenerate our assets, this is going to generate a new set of types for Pothos specifically that's going to sort of meld the different pieces of Pothos and our Prisma types together. So let's go ahead and regenerate Prisma. We'll do npx Prisma generate. And if I expand this a bit, we should see that we have generated the Prisma client, and now we've also generated these Pothos integration types. So that's exactly what we wanted. That's what we're going to be using here. But to actually use those types, we need to import them and actually register them with our builder. So I'm going to shorten down this terminal again, and back in our builder.ts, we need to import the Prisma plugin and the generated types. So first of all, I'll import the Prisma plugin from Pothos plugin Prisma. And after that, we need to import the generated types. So I'll import type Prisma types from, and this will also be from Pothos plugin Prisma, and it will be from the generated folder. So these are the two set of types. And then what you're going to notice is as soon as we imported these generated Prisma types, our builder let us know that there's an issue now. And that's because it's expecting us to have an instance of Prisma and its types sort of figured out within our builder because we are using this plugin. So that's super cool that it's smart enough to just automatically detect that. So in order to actually do that, we're going to need to do a couple of things. The first is we're going to need to set up our Prisma types. And we're going to do this within our generic up here. So we're basically saying that our Prisma types should follow these types that we just imported. After that, we need to register our plugin. So this will be the Prisma plugin. And then we're still going to get an error because Pothos right now is seeing all of this and it's saying, but I don't know anything about your Prisma setup. I don't know anything about the types that's generated from Prisma. And that's because we need to provide it an instance of our generated Prisma client so it can infer some of those types. And to do that, we're actually going to create a new file, and it's going to be called db.ts. And within here, all we're going to do is instantiate Prisma, and we're going to export it. So I'll import the Prisma client and export const Prisma equals new Prisma client. And the reason we're doing that is so that we can actually reuse this in different places. We're going to need to use it in a couple of different spots. So we are just going to do that there. But with that, we can now go back over into our builder. We can import Prisma from our DB file. And then we can actually configure the Pothos schema builder to use this. So what we're going to pass it is this new Prisma key that's available to us. And we're going to say that this client is the instance of our Prisma schema. So there we go. We've got it all configured to use the builder. We've got it configured to use these proper dates. We're generating the Pothos types based off of our Prisma types. So what this is actually going to do is this is setting us up for the second big phase of end-to-end type safety. Right now we have Prisma managing our database schema and generating types based off of that. So we sort of already have this glue between our database and our backend code, and we've got sort of types based off of that. So what we're doing really is making the Prisma schema our source of truth for types. And then building off of that source of truth, we're now also saying that Pothos is going to use types from the generated Prisma client to let us know how we should build our GraphQL API and to force us to build it in a way that's safe with our Prisma schema. So now this source of truth in our Prisma schema is handling our database schema and our GraphQL API schema. And what we're going to do next is actually use this safe schema builder now to build out that GraphQL API in a type-safe way with our Prisma schema. So to start doing that, we're going to go over to our source directory, and let's create a new folder in it called models. This is where we're going to set up our different GraphQL schema types and model out sort of our data in the GraphQL schema. Within there, create a new file called user.ts. This is where we'll configure our users and import that instance of the builder because we will be using that to build the GraphQL schema. And what we're going to use this builder for is to build a GraphQL type that sort of describes what a user should have in our GraphQL API. And this may seem redundant. This may seem like we already described the shape of a user in our Prisma schema. Why do we need to do it here as well? And that's because the Prisma schema is defining what's available in your database. So it's defining what the data in your database looks like and how you're storing it there, while the GraphQL schema is defining what data is exposed through your API. So you might, within your code, rename fields. You might calculate different fields and new fields that don't actually exist in your database, but they're available in your GraphQL API. You might exclude fields from your API that are available in your database. And so what the GraphQL schema does is it actually defines what's available just from the API. It doesn't really matter what's in your database. It just shows what's in your API. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to do builder.prisma object, and we have access to this function because we are using the Prisma plugin. And we're going to say that we want to create a user object. And if you notice, I'll go back here and do control space. It actually tells us what models that we have in our Prisma schema because we have that nice type safety set up. So we actually could just select one here. I'll pick the user. And this is going to take in a configuration object, and the one that we're going to fill out is called fields. And this will take in a function with t, and this t is going to be a helper that lets us configure some of these fields. And we're going to expose 3 fields from our database. We're going to expose ID, name, and our messages field. And you could do this using these helper functions from t. So I'll do expose ID, that's a helper available. And once I type the quotes, it gives us a list of the different columns available. And so I'll pick ID. And once again, that's because of the magic of Pothos and its Prisma plugin. The next one that we're going to do is a string. So we'll do expose string. And the only string field we have is a name, so that's the only one that pops up. And then finally, this messages. And this is a little bit different because this is a relation field. So this isn't actually just a static scalar. So what we're going to do is t.relation, and then it knows, because of the magic working behind the scenes, that the only relation this user model has is this messages one. So we can add that there. And so that's the whole user object built out. And I have this snippet here that I want to copy over just to let you know sort of what was going on here. Now I'll do a comment like this. So what we've really done is written a GraphQL schema type that looks like this. That's basically what this maps to. So when we use the builder object, it has a function called builder.toSchema. When we've run that, it's going to look at this user Prisma object that we've set up and the fields that we've defined and how we're exposing all these fields. And it's basically going to build this for us. And so that's pretty cool. We don't have to worry about learning this GraphQL syntax. We could just do it right in a language we're familiar with, which is JavaScript. So now that we've got our user defined, let's go ahead and define our message. So we'll do message.ts in a new file. And same as this, we're going to import our builder, and we will do builder.Prisma object. This one's going to be called message. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to do fields as a function. And I'll actually write that myself because I want to do it as an arrow function. And then we're going to expose a couple of fields. And the ones that we're going to do are the ID, the body, and the created at. And this created at is the reason that we had to add our custom date scalar type, because we want to expose it here. So once again, we'll do expose ID. We'll do the ID column. And we'll do this. And I think I capitalized that when I shouldn't have. There we go. So this should be ID. And then this will be t.expose string again, because this is our string body. And then this last one's going to be a little bit different. We have to sort of customize the expose ourselves. So there's this function just called expose. And what we're going to do is expose created at. So we're doing t.expose created at. And then we have to configure how to expose this. So we're just going to say that we want this type to be date. And Pothos is going to know about our date type because we registered it. So there we go. We've defined our user model. We've defined our message model. And now we can start actually defining the different queries for this data. To do that, there's a little bit of setup we've got to do. We need to go to our builder.ts, and then right here, I'm going to do a builder.queryType. And I will set that up, and it needs an empty object. And what we're doing here is we're initializing a query type. So if we were to look at a GraphQL schema, we would basically say type query, and then that's it. So we're basically just making an empty query type. And what we're going to do in our model files is we're going to actually add entries to this. So we might have a user's query that has a bunch of different types in there. So that's what we're going to be building out with this. So this is just the base type that we need. And then we can head over to our users. And over here, we're going to create a GraphQL query for a full set of users. And in order to do that, we're going to need to query the database. So I'm going to import Prisma from the DB file. And then beneath this, I'll do builder.queryField. And so this is going to add a field to that query type that we set up. And this field's going to be called users. And what this is going to take is another function with t, which is basically just the convention. That's just what is used for any helper functions that Pothos is going to provide us. And then here we will do t.prisma, if I could spell this right, Prisma field. And we're going to need to define a couple of options. So we're querying for users. We're setting up a query called users. And so naturally, we will know that we want to return a list of users. So we'll do type. We'll do this bracket so that we know that we're going to be returning an array. And then within here, we can do user. So now we're telling this query that it's going to be named users, and it's going to return an array of user objects. And then we need to know how to actually resolve this. So we're going to have an async function. And this is going to take in a couple of parameters. It's going to take in query, root, args, ctx, and info. And then it's going to run a function. So we're going to use these arguments to actually build up our query. And this query one here, this is actually something that gets added because we're using this Prisma Pothos plugin. This is going to be a Prisma query object that's sort of provided to us that we can pass down into our Prisma queries based on the GraphQL request that comes in. So that's pretty cool there, and we'll see what that does in just a second. But for this actual query, what we're going to do is we're going to return prisma.user.findMany, and then we're going to pass this in the query object destructured. And that's because Pothos under the hood is going to read the request coming in through GraphQL, and on its own, it's going to build up a filter object for us. So if we need to filter down the data or select out specific fields, it's going to build that query object for us in a performant way, and we're just going to use that here. So that all looks good, and that should handle our GraphQL query for users. And actually, at this point, if we head over to Firefox again, I'll refresh the page. And actually, I think we need to start our dev server. There we go, GraphQL. We can see we still only have this greetings query object, and that's because we're building up our schema, but we're not actually applying it to our GraphQL API yet. And we will do that in just a little bit, but I just wanted to make you aware that if you were working on this on your own, and if you were trying to figure out where this was exposed at, it's not actually being exposed yet. So we'll get there in just a few seconds. But for now, we're gonna move on to the next piece. And that is actually generating our GraphQL schema based off of this. So all we really needed was this one query, because if you think about our application, it just grabbed a list of users and their messages, and this one query is going to handle that for us. So what we need to do at this point is actually generate our GraphQL schema now and apply that to our GraphQL API. So create a new file in your source directory, and it's going to be called schema.ts. And we're going to import the builder here as well from builder. And then what we're going to do is import our model files. And that's because if we think about how this code is going to run, we have these model files, but they're not actually being referenced anywhere. So this code won't actually run unless it gets imported or referenced from somewhere. So what we're going to do here is we're going to actually make sure that this code runs and that these models get applied to our builder before we build our schema. So we're importing the builder, we are applying all of our different models and GraphQL types, and then we're going to use the builder's toSchema function, but we're going to export the results of that because it will export a schema. So we're going to export a const called schema, and that's going to equal builder.toSchema. And there is some config you can pass into this, but we're just going to leave that empty. But this schema that actually gets generated, it gets generated in abstract syntax tree syntax. So it's not actually exporting a stringified version of your GraphQL schema. It's just a big object that represents one. So if we were to log it out, we wouldn't actually see our GraphQL schema, but it will work. So in order to actually use this, we need to go to our index file now, where we're actually setting up our server, and we need to import our schema. So we'll import schema from schema. And then down here, there is a schema option right here. And so we'll just use schema, and that should apply our GraphQL schema now to our GraphQL API. So now all of these types that we've defined and this query that we've defined should be exposed through our GraphQL API. So let's go back to our browser and verify that. And back over in the browser, what we're going to see is the playground that we saw before, except this time if you head over to the Explorer, you're going to see that you have access to your user's query now, and that's because we've exposed it through our GraphQL API. And if you expand this query, you see the different fields that we have. So I'll just check off ID and name, and then we also have access to the fields of each message. And so I'll check the body and the created at. And if you run this query, it should already work. So we'll get our list of users back, the ID, the name, the messages, and all the data that we selected. And if you really think about it, this is super cool because if you look at the code for the query, it's not a whole lot. All we've done is let the builder know that we have a user type, that we want an array of users from this query named users. And then we pass it in this really simple function, just the prisma.user.findMany. And we pass in this query object destructured. And this was built by Pothos, and that's why this piece is so easy. So coming to the end of this, we've now successfully built out our whole GraphQL API. As you just saw, we are getting data from it, and the data is accessible through our API, so we can actually call this from the front end. And so in the next video, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to head back to our front-end application. We're going to query our GraphQL API, and we're also going to set up something called GraphQL CodeGen that allows us to make this query happen in a type-safe way, so we know exactly which data is available and we know which data we're going to get back. And we're going to do that to replace our manually written TypeScript types with these automatically generated ones. That way our whole application is in sync with our API. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I hope you'll join me.